They say the mountains of Colorado are peaceful, but some places hold memories that never die. In the heart of those silent woods, there stands an old government cabin, abandoned by everyone who tried to live there. Locals call it the Marsh Cabin, a place where the cries of a mother and her lost child still echo through the mist. When a forest officer named David Miller moved in, he thought he was starting a new life. But what he found inside was something far older and far colder than death itself. This is the haunting at Pine Ridge Cabin, a true story of sorrow, fire, and the spirit that never found peace. When I first arrived at Pine Ridge, a small mountain town in Colorado, I thought I had found paradise. The peaks were covered in soft snow. The air smelled of pine and smoke, and the silence of the forest felt like peace itself. After years of working in Denver, I had finally been transferred to a quiet post in the mountains as part of my job with the U.S. Forest Service. My duty was to oversee a section of the forest, check ranger stations, and monitor wildlife activity. It sounded perfect for someone like me, who preferred solitude over the chaos of the city. The government provided housing to the officers, a row of wooden cabins built during the 1940s. Most of them were worn down but still sturdy. Mine was cabin number 7, located at the far end of the forest line, surrounded by tall pines and a narrow gravel road that led to nowhere. When the caretaker handed me the keys, he gave me a long look and muttered, "You're taking cabin 7? Folks don't stay there long." I laughed it off. I wasn't the kind of man who scared easily. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my mornings hiking through the forest trails and my evenings sitting by the fireplace, reading or writing in my logbook. The cabin had a rustic charm. Creaky floors, an old stone chimney, and windows that rattled every time the wind blew. Sometimes, the silence was so deep that I could hear the crackle of the fire like whispers. I remember thinking that this was the kind of life I had always wanted. Quiet, detached, surrounded by nature. It was on the 5th night that I first heard the knocking. It came around midnight, 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the wooden door. I froze. The cabin was dark except for the dim glow of the dying fire. I waited, thinking it might have been a tree branch or the wind, but then it came again. 3 soft knocks, perfectly spaced. I grabbed my flashlight, walked to the window and looked out into the fog. The forest was still. The only movement came from the swaying pine trees under the moonlight. I stood there for a long moment before telling myself it was nothing and went back to bed. But I didn't sleep well after that. Over the next few nights, strange things began to happen. The air inside the cabin would suddenly turn cold, even when the fireplace was burning strong. I often woke up to the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway, though I lived alone. Once I heard what sounded like a faint lullaby. A woman humming softly, the way mothers do when rocking a baby to sleep. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, straining my ears. The melody was distant but hauntingly clear, floating through the night air from somewhere outside the cabin. I walked to the window and saw nothing but thick mist rolling across the yard. Still, the humming continued for another minute before fading into silence. The next evening I decided to stay up late, hoping to catch whoever was playing games. Around midnight, the same lullaby began again, soft and sorrowful. I turned off the lights, grabbed my flashlight, and peered outside. That's when I saw her, a woman standing at the edge of the trees. She wore a long white coat that almost blended into the fog, and she appeared to be holding something small in her arms, maybe a bundle or a baby. My first thought was that she might be lost or in trouble. I stepped out into the cold and called out, "Hey, do you need help?" She didn't answer. She turned her head slightly, and even through the mist I could feel her eyes on me. Then she started walking slowly backward into the forest until the fog swallowed her whole. I stood there for several minutes, trying to understand what I had seen. The rational part of me said it must have been some lost traveler or even my imagination. But another part, the part that felt the chill down my spine, whispered otherwise. The next morning I went into town to buy supplies. I stopped by the local general store and casually mentioned what I had seen. The old storekeeper went silent. He looked at me with a kind of pity and said, "You're staying in the Marsh cabin, aren't you?" I frowned, not knowing what he meant. He sighed and continued, "That's what folks around here call it. Used to belong to a ranger named Thomas Marsh. Lived there with his wife Evelyn and their baby boy back in the 1950s. One winter night, Thomas was out on patrol when the cabin caught fire. They say Evelyn tried to save her baby but couldn't. They found her outside in the snow, clutching him in her arms. Both of them had burned. The story made me feel cold all over. I asked him where they were buried, and he pointed toward the forest line near the old trail. No one goes there anymore, he added. Every few years someone stays in that cabin, but they never last. They always say they hear her singing or a baby crying. I drove back to the cabin in silence. The wind had picked up, and the tall pines groaned like they were alive. That night I tried to convince myself that the story was just a legend, small-town folklore meant to scare outsiders. But when I went to bed, the knocking returned, 3 times soft but clear. I sat up in bed staring at the door. My flashlight lay beside me, and for a moment I considered ignoring it. But curiosity got the better of me. When I opened the door, the cold hit me like a wall. The wind had stopped. The fog was thick enough to blur everything beyond a few feet. I stepped outside and turned the flashlight toward the tree line, and froze. She was there again, the same woman in white, standing motionless, staring back at me. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow. She whispered something, but the sound was lost in the wind. I couldn't move. I could only watch as she slowly raised her arms, and I saw the small burned blanket she was holding. Then, without warning, she was gone. The next morning I went straight to the local church. The pastor, Father Henry, listened quietly as I told him everything. He didn't look surprised. "That spirit has been here for decades," he said. "She's not evil. She's lost, trapped by sorrow." He gave me a small wooden cross and promised to visit the cabin to pray over it. That evening, Father Henry came to the cabin. He stood by the fireplace and read verses in a calm voice. The air felt heavy, as if the cabin itself was listening. Halfway through the prayer, a sudden gust of cold wind swept through the room, blowing out the candles. The fire flickered violently. I heard a faint cry, the unmistakable sound of a baby weeping from somewhere behind us. Father Henry's voice trembled for a moment, but he kept reading until the air settled again. When it was over, he looked exhausted. "She's not gone," he said quietly, "but she's at peace for now." For the next few days, everything seemed normal. The knocking stopped, and the nights were quiet. I almost started to believe it was all over. But then, near the end of winter, the final night came. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of crying. It was louder than before, closer. My heart pounded as I followed the sound through the dark hallway. It led me to the back door near the kitchen. The crying turned into soft, desperate sobs, mixed with whispers that seemed to echo from the walls. My hands shook as I reached for the doorknob. When I opened it, I saw her standing just a few feet away. Evelyn Marsh. Her face was streaked with tears and ash, her eyes full of pain. She held her baby tightly against her chest. Smoke rose from her dress like faint mist. She looked right at me and whispered, "Please." "He's cold." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. She took one slow step forward, and I felt the temperature drop. The fire in the living room went out with a hiss. My breath came in short gasps as I whispered, "I can't help you." She shook her head slowly, then lifted her burned baby's blanket toward me. "You saw him," she said in a voice that didn't sound human. "Give him back to me." I stumbled backward, tripping over the rug. The lights flickered once and then died. For a few seconds, all I could see was her glowing outline. a figure made of sorrow and smoke. Then she screamed, a sound so filled with grief that it felt like the whole cabin shook. The next thing I remember, everything went black. When I woke up, it was morning. I was lying near the fireplace shivering. The other rangers had found me unconscious when I failed to respond to the radio. They said the cabin smelled like smoke, but there had been no fire. When I stepped outside, I saw ashes scattered across the front porch, and lying among them was a small charred piece of cloth. The same burnt blanket I had seen in her arms. I left Pine Ridge the very next day. Before I drove away, I stopped by the old graveyard near the forest. Under a tall pine tree was a weathered stone that read, Evelyn Marsh and Baby Thomas, 1958. Someone had left wildflowers on the grave, still fresh despite the cold. I placed my cross there and whispered, "You can rest now." Years have passed since then. I never went back to that mountain post. I've lived in cities, in apartments filled with light and sound, but sometimes, on long winter nights, I still wake to a faint knocking sound. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on my door. Every time my heart stops for a moment, because part of me still wonders if somewhere out there, in the frozen silence of those Colorado mountains, Evelyn Marsh is still wandering through the fog, forever searching for the warmth she lost that terrible night.